So we're at war. What does that mean though anymore, right? Missiles, bombs, planes, all that stuff. Not necessarily. What does everyone think about when they think of information warfare? That's not what we're going to talk about today. So to look at it, let's first define it. Rand has a really great definition of information warfare. Combination of 6 things: OPSEC, EW, PSYOPs, deception, physical attack on information systems, and information attack or on information processes. The World Economic Forum has a more concise version. So, electronic warfare, cyber warfare, and PSYOPs. So I tried to make this even more concise. So here's my definition. Hacking minds and machines. Manipulating is probably better, but since we're black hat, to talk about it from the perspective of hacking. We can't forget the defense part, so we'll be talking about some of that too. But really, since we're black hat, and everyone's talking about hacking machines, the focus today is going to be on the minds part. So, these two things come together in a very important way though. So, being able to have effective capabilities on both the technological side, the C&E, C&O side, as well as the PSYOP side. So a quick, as they say, Plato to NATO. Warfare's typically been fought across a few domains. The first and most obvious has always been land. So needs no real discussion. Sea came along shortly after, great. Air came along way later. So wasn't possible pre-1903, but early on, it fell under the Army. So we actually had the Army Air Corps. In 1945, the Air Force was formed. And what's interesting about air as a domain versus the other domains is that you still have air components in the Navy, you still have air components in the Army, and you still have air components in the, in the Marine Corps. Fourth domain was space. I assume this is what space warfare looks like. I am not familiar at all. And then information. So this is called the 5th domain. And then it's also called 5D warfare. So I stuck a 5-dimensional cube up there too. But we talk about it in a lot of different ways, right? In 2011, the US was the first state or entity to recognize information as a domain of warfare. NATO came along last year and recognized cyber as a domain of warfare. I think this kind of has a lot to do with the fact that we as a community have lost the battle on cyber in the grand scheme of things. I know everyone was trying to keep it information security for the last 20 years and avoid cyber, but they seem to have won. But it's really talking about the same thing. So the first cyber attack that we broadly know about, actually I'm not even going to say first cyber attack because I'm going to dispute myself in a little bit. But why is it important for NATO to recognize cyber or information as a domain of warfare? Initially, 2007, this is a statue that's in Tallinn, Estonia. And they decided to move it. And it was put there, it's the grave of a lot of Soviet soldiers. And Russia was very unhappy about this. And in 2007, there was right as they decided to move the statue, there was a large-scale, unattributed cyber attack that occurred in Estonia. So at the time, nothing could really be done. But with the recognition of cyber as a domain, we're now talking about the potential for Article 5, which is mutual defense. This means that any NATO nation that's attacked on any recognized domain of warfare can invoke Article 5, and all of the now 30 or 29 members of NATO can then go in and act on their behalf. The only time this was done was September 11th, but it now has the potential to be done for a cyber attack. It's sort of a strange turn of events, but it's probably long overdue. Another interesting component about this is that everyone generally reserves the right to not necessarily respond in kind. So you could actually launch missiles about a cyber attack, or you could later on do a cyber attack. So they talk about doing it in the way and time of their choosing in response. So in the US, we have Cyber Command. Now, like the Air Force, and I think this is the direction we're going. I actually wrote a paper on this with a think tank that I work with. But just like the Air Force, I think we're going to see cyber-specific forces or information-specific forces turn up. And I think we'll still see cyber and information capabilities with the other branches of service, but I think we'll end up there probably in the near future. I'm hoping we don't end up like this, but who knows? To reference Ray's comment at the last talk, a buddy of mine and I were talking about the uniform for a cyber corps, and he said, well, we need it in like a slimming black uniform. So NATO on their website, they have a cyber timeline. And it goes back to '88, lists the RTM, the Robert Morris worm, as the first cyber attack. I sort of disagree. I'm going to take it back a couple of years earlier. Anyone recognize this man? I'm disappointed. I should see a ton of hands right now. This is Cliff Stoll. So, 1986, he worked at, I believe it was Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. He was an astronomer that worked with computers. And in his own words, if you asked a fellow astronomer how he was, they'd be like, well, this is a shitty astronomer, but he's really good at computers. And if you ask a computer person, they'd say, he's shitty with computers, but he's a great astronomer. So he's right there in the middle, right? But his boss noticed that there was a few cent discrepancy on some computer usage. And he didn't like it. He started investigating it. Turns out that the KGB had hired a German hacker who had gotten into, this is a national laboratory. They're doing a lot of very sensitive research. And they had been exfiltrating information for a long time. He details this story in a book called The Cuckoo's Egg. I spoke at a NATO conference last year, and one of the, it was a panel, and one of the questions that was asked to me as the American there was, why is it that the US is so far ahead of everyone else in this capacity? I said, look, this happened to us first. This happened to us in '86, and people are just now experiencing their first attacks in other countries around the world. So this has been on the US's, I guess, radar for that long. So in the international relations community, and in fact I've heard this a lot from really well-regarded IR people, they say, well, this isn't real war. Code doesn't explode. That's become the slogan of this, right? And that's true, code doesn't explode, but it spins centrifuges, and more importantly, it influences the decisions. So ultimately, we're talking about inception, right? We're talking about impacting decisions, preferably in ways that the people making these decisions aren't aware. So let's do a quick example of this. We make up a story. And this could be anything. We'll talk more about what types of stories to make up in a minute. But this is not a true story. This is something we've decided will get into people's heads and influence their decisions in months, years from now in a direction we want it to go. Or even days or weeks these days. So you make up a story, you start with a small local newspaper. Now, I'm a state actor, so I own this newspaper. Although you could never trace funds and prove that. But, so I have a small local newspaper, no obvious bias in the reporting, and 99% of what I print is just off the wire. So, almost zero effort, right? Just get stories off the wire, stick it in there. You do a few local stories, you do a little bit of coverage of things, and you just keep this going for when you want to use it. And then you plant a seed. So we start off with a very small version of our eventual story. We put it out there. Then we wait a little bit. And lately we're seeing less time in between that event and the next one. But typically it's been weeks, months, even years. So now you have a mid-sized regional news org. Not one you own, although in some cases, these days, that's certainly the case. But one you at least have some influence in. And you reference that initial story from the local paper. Can be small or big coverage, doesn't matter. We're building a foundation of the ideas that we're wanting to convey, right? So up next, we eventually get it to where it is picked up by newswires. And at this point, this story shows up in nearly every publication around the world. It's pretty amazing. If you watch this progress, you'll see here's this little story. The second something's picked up by a newswire, Sydney Morning Herald, the Telegraph, whatever. It's all over the world. This is going to cite the mid-sized news org. And at this point, your story's everywhere. More importantly, your idea is everywhere. So, this is not what people are calling fake news. This is termed information laundering. So, we're just like a money laundering scheme. We're taking something in and we're trying to hide the original source of this information, right? Now, here's a quick example of this that happened very recently. So it's in Russian. I don't read Russian. I'm assuming most people here don't. But this was satire. So it's supposedly a letter written from an American sailor to his wife or girlfriend back home, right? And the story goes, and it's actually been translated, put out on Facebook. Social media is obviously great for this. The story goes that he was out to sea on a ship, and this amazing Russian airplane with this amazing weapon that they just didn't know anything about came up and disabled all of their electronic warfare capabilities, all of their electronic capabilities. This would be electronic warfare, right? Suddenly, this got picked up. Now, this was from a Russian news source, and they added in a quote from an American general or general saying, yeah, they totally destroyed our capabilities with this, EW weapon on this airplane. Soon after that, starts getting picked up, ends up on news wires. Russia claims it can wipe out entire U.S. Navy with a single electronic bomb in a bizarre propaganda report. Now, that recognizes that this is propaganda. But then it gets picked up even more so, and now we just have this. So, this probably was intended for this to happen, right? The claim is that the original report was satire, but this is likely a very planned effort. So what's fake news? If this isn't fake news, what is fake news? I have it on pretty good authority that fake news is just anything that does not conform to your existing biases. So in reality though, fake news is super easy. Registered domain, mirror an actual news site, you know, change up the story, add a story, whatever, and put it out there on social media. And it's amazing how effective this is. So this is Le Soir, and I want to highlight the .be. That's the actual news site. It's a French language. It's very very widely known publication. So a little while ago, this showed up, and the screenshot is a little older than the Le Soir screenshot that's before that, but it actually looked exactly like the Le Soir site. And this says, Emmanuel Macron, the newly elected French president, is the preferred candidate of Saudi Arabia. Now, if you're French, that is not something you're real happy about. So, turns out this was on lesoir.info, not lesoir.be. And if you clicked on any of the links, it actually took you to the corresponding .be site, and if you just showed up at lesoir.info, it redirected you to .be. It's actually one of the more clever ones that I've seen. A lot of them, it's really bad. But, so, started doing some research. They were using a CDN to kind of mask where this was hosted and all this. But I was able to find some domain name, or DNS server history. And on March 1st, it was switched over to Cloudflare. But before that, it was a word space. So below that, on the screenshot, you'll see a dig request to that initial, to that original name server of lesoir.info, and I get this IP. Now, this is based in Sofia, Bulgaria. So if you start looking into the domain, lesoir.info, you come up with this, which is kind of interesting, some of the names and stuff. It's actually a really typical characteristic of a well-known threat actor. They will come up with some names and addresses, and they're registering like hundreds of domains, and they change like one thing at a time. So you'll know, I mean, it's not even good. There's no house number. The postal code is not a Delaware postal code. In fact, it's not a US postal code at all. And in fact, it's a Bulgarian postal code. And this type of thing is pretty common. So now I'm not actually saying that this is Bulgaria. I'm saying that this is probably intended to look like it's Bulgaria. So that story, that one story that wasn't really effectively well done, had over 10,000 shares on Facebook and thousands of tweets and retweets. And if you look at Google Trends, so you'll see that Macron and Saudi Arabia were almost never searched. The day it breaks, it still wasn't that big, but by election day, it's all the way up to 100. So this actually had a huge impact. And I'm not sure that anyone knows what exactly that impact is or how we would measure it, but if everyone's searching for it, then it's a pretty good indicator of how effective this was. Now, in the information warfare world, we've got a few different levels here. Create a fake news site being the easiest. Hack an actual news site. Start your own state-controlled media. That's much more effective. But if you can effectively launder information, you're well above and beyond in the game. Now, if you're not a nation state, this is a lot harder to do, right? The bottom two are fairly difficult. You guys, anybody do a lot of pen testing or hire pen testers? So this is always my favorite thing, and this pen testing is something I spend a lot of my time on, but This is one of my favorite things to hear from a pen tester. And I can patently say that, in fact, the Grug has a great quote on this, that the APT is the will of the state. It's a lot more involved than a little bit of technology or some code or whatever else. We're talking about the will of the state coming against you. So, how can you do this if you're not a state, if you don't have the resources of a state? So obviously social media is great, but sticking with our inception theme, we need to go deeper. So, like in the movie, they go into your dreams to plant ideas in the subconscious or whatever, right? And then this boils to the surface in different ways. So the internet kind of has its own sort of outer world and maybe a Jungian shadow. So any guesses at what that might be? No? Okay. So, no? Okay. Well, the chans, 4chan and all that are actually really great places to start with this. I've done some pretty interesting experiments with just planting hoaxes and getting tons of support from people who don't care at all. and it's super effective. But when you go out there and you start trying to plant this idea, you can't force it. Since no one's getting the last joke, they're not going to get this one either. But so how do you take your idea and have it replicate itself? So at this point, we're not talking about people copying the idea. We're talking about the idea using people as a medium to spread itself. So there's a particularly vulnerable group to this, I found, and it's conspiracy theorists. Now this applies much more broadly, but this is the easier one to go after. So we're going to start there. And so initially, confirmation bias. If your idea fits into someone else's current belief, and in terms of conspiracy, if you have it be consistent with a conspiracy theory that someone believes, better yet, have it link a few together in creative ways. Can everybody see this? So, all right, great. So when people believe something to be the case, and something else supports it, they tend to just roll with it, right? So that's trait one. Trait two, many loose connections. So preferably a bunch of loose ends that the investigators can actually then create new links to other things you never thought of. And they will absolutely do this if you tie it into the first trait. Then you got proportionality bias. This is that the explanation has to match the size of the outcome. So we saw a lot of this after 9/11. There's no way a few guys could plan this and bring down, all these buildings and do all this damage. Must have been, something else, something bigger. You see a lot of this ending up with the Illuminati too. So, big things require big explanation in most people's minds. Projection. So the conspiracy you're trying to pitch has to be something that the people who are looking into it would actually like to be a part of. And you'll notice this with a lot of conspiracy theory, right? It's like, these rich, powerful people that rule the world. And I mean, who wouldn't want that? So, one of my favorite quotes, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. Finally, unmasking the conspiracy has to empower, or at least let them feel empowered, alienated, disaffected, unrepresented people. Or, that has to make sense of uncontrollable external forces. It just feels better that way, right? When there's a plan. So, 50% of US citizens believe in at least one conspiracy theory. 63% of registered US voters. So, you actually have a higher population of voters that believe than non-voters. 42% of high school graduates, and with a postgraduate degree, 23%. So you actually do see some dropping off with education, and this happens from both sides of the political spectrum. So party bias does not really weigh in here. So we've got this, of course. But think back a little bit, and we've got this. Now, I don't think this was one of the high school graduates because they didn't even spell the president's name wrong. And you go back a few more years, and you've got this. So it doesn't seem to matter what the affiliation or what the actual ideas are. Everyone jumps into these. And what's interesting for us is that this actually mobilizes people. It gets people off their couch and sitting down somewhere else with a sign. Or out here doing this. Sort of frighteningly, it also can get people out with guns doing crazy stuff. So when you're doing this, you want to focus on the easily digestible big headlines. Anybody spend any time on Reddit in here? You go in the comments, and does anybody notice like someone will come up with this, 4-paragraph long, really, detailed, compelling thing that has nothing to do with what the article was actually about, but just the title. So no one actually reads anything. No one actually does anything with this. You just have to get that soundbite. So here's our checklist. Does it fit into currently believed things? Plenty of loose connections, internal and external. Is it proportionate? And that can be proportionate for the outcome or proportionate to the conspiracy. Whichever one you're doing. You can go both ways with this. And does it pass the projection test? And of course, does uncovering it empower the unempowered? So let's look at one. This is a particularly fun one. It's sort of dark, but how many people have heard this? Nearly everybody, right? So let's look into it a little bit. In 1983, there was a letter to a newspaper in India called Patriot, and it just said, "I'm a well-regarded scientist in the U.S. and this is what's happening. The U.S. government created the AIDS virus as part of its chemical warfare campaigns up in Maryland somewhere. AIDS is a result of the Pentagon's experiments to develop new and dangerous biological weapons." That's the actual quote. There was much more to it. And so that gets published in the newspaper, and then not much happens. So it's in 83. And then 85, another newspaper republished it. Same letter, referenced the original newspaper. 86, a German scientist who was actually born in Russia, but educated in France, was doing some research, and some people came along and gave him some information and some evidence. And that evidence linked to the AIDS virus being a combination of two other viruses created by none other than the US government. He wrote this up in a paper. It was published in a fairly well-regarded journal. And all of a sudden, this was covered in 80 countries in 30 different languages. So this is our hit the news wire phase right here. And people believed it. So here's some polls. Let's see if I can increase the size of this. No. So, yeah, 1988. Some truth in reports that AIDS virus was produced in germ warfare laboratory. 38% people believed it. 90, AIDS is a man-made virus. 34%. 1990, AIDS is a form of genocide against the black race. 35% believe that. 92, 2001, HIV is a man-made virus. 50%. 2002, AIDS was produced in a government laboratory. 27%. 2004, again 50%. 2008, we're at 46. 2008, down at 28. 2009, 24%. Anybody notice what happened in 92? I just kind of skipped over it. The KGB director, who eventually went on to become the Prime Minister of Russia, admitted that this was a KGB disinformation operation. So in 1992, the Russian government came clean on this. Yet, if we look back, that's in the top half still. Did anyone hear about that in the news? So, after they came clean, everyone still believed. So, let's compare this to our list. You have fairly wide belief of, okay, well, the US government's bad, CIA's bad, whatever, right? So, give that one a yes. Plenty of loose connections? Absolutely. There's almost no detail here. It was just, this virus was created to hurt people. Could be anybody. Is the conspiracy proportionate? Absolutely. I mean, think back to 83, 86. All these people were dying. It was really crazy. And nobody wants to think it's just this, right? So, does it pass the projection test? Well, so the world power thing, and does uncovering it empower the unempowered? Absolutely. So, if years and years later, people still believe it after, and they've produced evidence that is in fact the KGB who came to Dr. Segal and provided this evidence that he then used to link back to the US government. So that was in 99 that happened, and that was publicized. So, what can we actually do? So, one, we can use the same techniques. Conveniently, the truth happens to be a little stickier, right? But in counter-propaganda, you never try to convert. And actually, a great example of this is just anything anyone believes and you're talking to them about something else. If you're trying to convert them, you will absolutely fail. So we have to create doubt. There's a fantastic article about this. This is in the headline even, so you don't have to read the article, just read the headline and you're good. It's a fantastic article. I highly recommend it if you're interested. And yeah, the truth is much more sticky than fiction. You have to do a lot of work to spread disinformation. If you're using the truth, then it's a lot easier to do. For instance, you got Emmanuel Macron here again. This was the first tweet to lesoir.info. At least that still exists. And of course, here's the fake news article. Anybody notice anything kind of weird about this? So the tweet was from February 17th, 2017. The article it's linking to was from February 24th, 2017. So the people doing this typically aren't even that detailed about it. It's pretty fascinating. Everybody followed Vault 7, like the WikiLeaks release of all the CIA tools. So this was another really kind of obvious one where minutes before WikiLeaks actually put the information out there, a few newspapers were publishing full analysis of a lot of these tools before they had been released. A lot of other ones published analysis showing very obviously well-researched conclusions minutes after the release. So clearly no one had the time to sit there and look through all that unless they were given access to it early. So from there you can pretty easily start concluding what happened there, right? Just based on some of the things we've seen. This is the person that tweeted it. Pretty strong, 2 followers and following 8 people. Got the UN guy with his head in the sand. And most of these trolls and things like that are pretty obviously that once you start looking into it. But it's still amazingly effective to get a lot of information out there. 3, we can understand our own biases. Anything that confirms something I believe, I try to be doubly skeptical of, right? This is fairly obvious, I think. But this is a great little pie chart. So the green there is what we know that we know. Anybody remember the Donald Rumsfeld speech? It got made fun of constantly, but it is actually some pretty good information. So what we know that we know is green. What we know that we don't know is red. So I know that I know nothing about space war or astrophysics. But then everything left is stuff that we don't know that we don't know. So stuff that exists, maybe, that we just know nothing about. We have no context on. And our biases tend to be there. So we tend to believe something based on something we picked up at like 5 and just never rethink it. So it's good to be really skeptical and cautious of anything that just feels right when you're doing this type of research. And we can improve attribution. So cyber attacks, right? This is a really tough problem right now, as I'm sure everyone's aware. But I have a proposed attribution question 0, the one I think we should ask first, which is, whose foreign policies objectives does this advance? And almost every single time when you answer that question, the answer for that question ends up being the same as the answer after everything else has been investigated. It's kind of like Occam's razor a little bit. Now, not everything is a nation state, obviously, but when something is really significant, there tends to be some involvement these days. Any questions or anything like that? Yes, sir.
Check this out. So when you're propagating this information, how do you take into account that people watch certain kinds of media and then the information silos?
Absolutely. And the media certainly tends to fit with the confirmation bias thing too as well, right? So if you didn't hear the question, it was, how do you account for people that watch certain types of media? Well, the first thing you want to do is typically once something has hit a wire, it's going to be picked up by both sides, by most major media out there. So if you're actually effective at getting it to that stage, then it kind of solves itself. Now, one big thing is you really want to kind of go at this from both ends. So you want to have multiple stories that target multiple different vulnerabilities, let's say. So if you view this as analogous to vulnerable code on a server, right? So our checklist of 5 things. Now, there are different types of that. So you really want to create stories that target different core beliefs, different ideas, different conspiracy theories, or whatever thing you're targeting. The conspiracy theory is just an example. But, so you really want to target both angles to always further your end goal, right? So your end goal is typically going to be a few levels removed from whatever idea you're putting out there. You want this to inform someone to make a decision later in the direction you want. based on providing them with current information. If you look at a fairly obvious recent example of this that I've noticed was, if you look at the Drudge Report, the front page of it, you'll see a lot of stories that are fairly unrelated, but there was one on there the other day. It was about basically and I can't remember exactly the title, but effectively the wussification of the American man, right? And if you start looking at it through a lot of these perspectives, if your end goal is for someone to think a certain way and to want the world to be a certain way, then you just start pushing stories, pushing ideas that make it seem necessary for them to take action for them to achieve their own goals, right? And you can have something as simple as that type of a headline resulting in eventual political decisions, things like that. It's certainly marketing companies are very effective with this, and then we're seeing that improve every day with all kinds of fairly bizarre connections. But with some research, you can certainly link that, okay, people who believe this, this, and this tend to decide this way on this issue. And then you just push those things. Any other, okay, so that sufficiently answered it? Okay. Any other questions?